So I'll let Great. I'm also going to, and Ari, you might have to make me the host to do this, but I'm also going to send it to our Facebook page so that people can either watch it now or later, which we're only going to do for the classes that we Zoom, but yeah, so I'll let Kendra Troni introduce you while I think Ari has to make me host to be able to do that.
All right. Well, I am super excited to be here. I got a special invitation to be the introducer of this guest to kick off our Haggadah and Pesach, pre-Pesach studies. This is Joshua Cahan, Josh Cahan, and he is known to me in a really important way by the bencher that we have used every week since my husband Daniel and I got married. We got to know Josh in the Beit Midrash of the Jewish Theological Seminary, not far from Zabar's, which is what's on the mug he's drinking from right now.
Yeah. I was like, why are you mentioning Zabar's? Like, it's my fault.
Yeah, it's your mug. And he has a whole lot more to his name. I'll give you some of his bona fides right now. Rabbi Joshua Cahan compiled and edited that Yedid Nefesh bencher, which very importantly never asks you to turn a page while you're busy holding a cup of wine or anything else that you might spill on yourself. I just love that. And he's introducing the new Yedid Nefesh Haggadah this spring. He spent 13 years teaching high school Talmud and Tefilah in New York and 8 summers running the Beit Midrash program at Camp Ramah in Wisconsin. He may or may not, like me, have taken some days off to go and hang out at the Tipsy Turtle and other fun places downtown. What a fun place that Kollel is at Camp Ramah. He holds Rabbinic Ordination and a Ph.D. in Talmud from that same Jewish Theological Seminary. Tonight, he's going to talk about the following question. What story is the Haggadah telling? The Haggadah is a liturgy text whose focus is actually praise of God for the redemption from Egypt rather than the complex human drama. We'll take a quick tour through Maggid to see how that lens helps us to track its structure. Hopefully, we'll be able to end with a few thoughts about how we might find meaning in the act of declaring God's wonders. And as Rabbi Cahan was mentioning briefly before, he's also willing and able to share with you a little bit about that very exciting new Haggadah, since we are precisely 4 weeks away from the holiday of Passover, and nobody have a panic attack from my saying that, please. So Rabbi Cahan, without further ado, it's such a pleasure to see you on our screen. Welcome to Temple Beth on virtually.
Thank you so much. It is really exciting, and just to have the opportunity. I won't go into all of the different ways that I'm connected to various people in the shul, but because that would take my whole hour. So instead, I'm going to really just kind of use our time as efficiently as we can to talk about the Haggadah and to talk about kind of mindset for getting ready for our starim. The challenge of the Seder is that we come to it wanting to do the Seder both properly and creatively, and we have all of and then, but also we're getting ready for the holiday in all these other ways, and so we end up kind of doing whatever. So hopefully this will give us some just a little bit of a framing for approaching our starim sort of thoughtfully and in a little bit of a new way this year. So just as a kind of setting, we have this kind of, I think of it as a bifurcated approach to liturgy and ritual, which is we recite rituals, we perform them, and we also want to craft kind of meaningful experiences, but these are like separate, right? We will like do things that are meaningful and then recite the words. Or sometimes we'll use the liturgy as material for music and stuff like that, but that's different than actually engaging with liturgy texts. And liturgy texts are often hard to engage with. Now, I think a lot about finding ways to reclaim the liturgy as itself a vehicle for meaning, and doing it in ways that can feel authentic and real for us. And I've been spending a lot of time particularly thinking about the Haggadah and thinking about it. And here's the funny thing is we usually don't think of it in these terms, but thinking about it as a liturgy text in the same way that we think about what does it mean to engage with the text of the Siddur or a bench or something else. So I want to do two main things, and we'll see how they fit together. One is to kind of demystify the Haggadah text. We tend to encounter it, and the more that we are paying attention to the text itself, the more confused we often feel. That was really how I felt for a long time, until I really started spending significant time with it, and to think about how we can read that text kind of meaningfully. And the other is to introduce you to and share some things about my Haggadah. I promise I will sort of answer the question of, I will definitely answer the question of why did I put together a new Haggadah. I will not answer the question of, well, what's my unique take on the Haggadah, but I will explain why. So we're going to try to do those two things in the time we have, and hopefully they will kind of work together. There is a source sheet that has the sources for the first bit of what I'm going to talk about kind of before we get to the Haggadah itself. I'm going to share that. We'll see how many of those sources will at least make reference to many of those sources. Only read a few of them kind of closely, but you can now then have them to follow along.
Do you want me to share my screen, or do you want to just share the link again in the chat?
I just shared it again in the chat, didn't I?
Yes, you did. Yeah.
I just shared it again in the chat. I'm going to share a screen with a little kind of PowerPointy thing with some of the texts, and we'll kind of go, so you can see, you can get it one way or the other. Okay, but here's my little, and then so we're going to look at this, and then we will switch over to the Haggadah PDF in a few minutes. So first, basic. This is a piece that may be familiar to you, but is one of those things that you may not have really kind of thought through. Haggadah is the Seder ritual is a very text-based thing. It developed, the rabbinic ritual developed very much as an expansion of this biblical ritual. The later rabbinic ritual is very directly an expansion of the missions ritual. The kernel is here in Exodus chapter 12. And this is the first time that we have, this is the text that introduces the dynamic of question and answer as the activity for Seder night. And it says, in future years, ushmartem, you will observe, you will perform this ritual, this avodah. And then when your children inevitably ask, Ma ha'avodah hazot lachem, well, what is this ritual, this rite about? What does it mean to you? Then you'll tell them this is a Pesach offering to Adonai, because and you get the little wordplay here that God Pesach passed over our houses and struck the Egyptian firstborn. Now there are three components, right? You'll perform the ritual that will spark your child to ask about its meaning, and that is the opening for you to tell them about the Exodus. Right? Offering leads to question, question to story. And you can see that that structure of the ritual foods, question, answer is exactly is the sort of starting point for our Haggadah. It's even more obvious in the original version of the 4 questions, which are all about the ritual foods, right? The original Mishnah questions were about the Pesach, the matzah, and the maror. Now, the question that I want to think about is, what is the story we're supposed to tell as part of this ritual? When we talk about, we say, the child asks, and then you tell them the story, we read it as if it's very vague and we can fill it in as we want to. But this is actually more concrete, right? Here is the parent explaining, this is in Exodus chapter 12. So the beginning of this chapter is where they put the blood on the doorposts, and the last part of this chapter, the middle part of this chapter, after this little section, is where the plague of the firstborn actually happens. So this is actually, when it says, here's what you're going to say in the future, what you're going to say is, you're going to tell your child about something that actually hasn't happened yet for the next 20 verses. Right? But the real point is that you're not going to tell them the whole narrative of the last 11 chapters. You're only going to say, I'm doing this ritual because God saved us and struck them, because of what God did. Now, the version in chapter 13 is even simpler, right? That's another later slide, but you shall explain to your child, this is because of what God did for me when I left Egypt. Notice, no long, complicated, complex story, just I need my child to know what God did for us and for me personally when we left Egypt. Now, the Mishnah has some variation in terms of what we tell and how. It doesn't give a script for the answer. It gives a script for the questions, but not for the answers. It only gives guidelines. We should tailor our telling to the specific child, likely an allusion to the Midrash of the 4 children that we know so well, and that was already composed by the time of the Mishnah. And it tells us to tell a story that starts with disgrace and ends with praise. Starts with disgrace, ends with praise. So there's a lot of uncertainty about what that phrase was intended to mean, which gives rise to a lot of different kind of interpretations of this text. And we'll come back to that. And the third thing is that we should interpret the passage in Deuteronomy 26 that starts, my father was a wandering Aramean, etc., which is the central kind of piece of Maggid. Now, fast forward 1,000 years, right? And you find this. Now, this is Maimonides' sort of statement of the mitzvah of the Seder, but it is typical of every sort of medieval rabbi's explanation from his time to ours, right? It is a mitzvah, I say a positive commandment to relate l'saper, to relate the miracles and wonders done for our ancestors in Egypt. And then even great sages are obligated to recount the Exodus from Egypt. And so it's a positive commandment to relate or narrate these events. Even great sages must do it. And the more you do it, or at the greater length, the better. Now that is the mitzvah of the Seder. Aside from eating matzah, right? This is everything else about the Seder, as far as Maimonides is concerned, flows from this. Now, the thing is that if telling is meant to be at a level appropriate for sages, and one that could occupy them potentially all night, it must be an extended, detailed narration and analysis. Very different than, as God passed over our houses. Right? That's not quite the story we seem to be talking about here. Now, you may well recognize this language of even great sages are obligated and whoever does it more is better. You may recognize that from the beginning of our Haggadah. And in fact, our Haggadah text is source from Maimonides' rule. A little tricky because these two little pieces, this statement that even if we're all wise and sages and know the Torah, we have to tell the story, and the more we tell, the better. And this story about the 5 rabbis in Bnei Brak, they're separated, right? They're separate paragraphs, and this first part is attached to Avadim Hayinu, but that's actually misleading. This is really this thing over here. Can you see my little mouse there when it moves? This is actually just the introduction to this story. And we see essentially exactly what we saw in Maimonides, which is even sages need to do this. It is a mitzvah. It is the only thing that's described as a mitzvah to lisaper b'yetziat Mitzrayim, to recount, narrate the Exodus from Egypt, and to do so ideally at great length in great detail. You see, like, this is the image that we all have of what we're supposed to be doing, right? We're always looking for new ways to kind of analyze the story and new ways to bring it to life and to act it out and to discuss it. How do we sort of wring more and more out of this story? The same story we've been working over for countless years. The famous story of the rabbis in Bnei Brak is really just directly an illustration of this principle, right? Everyone, even sages, do it, and the more the better. And here's a story of 5 great early rabbis sitting in Bnei Brak who were doing exactly this, misaprim Mitzrayim, recounting, right, all night, and they had to be stopped by their students in the morning. They could have gone into the next day. This reads like and has been treated as the mission statement for our entire Seder. The goal is recounting and retelling the story of the Exodus in elaborate and creative ways. Now, it has always mystified me, and I hope that it has confused you too, that the Haggadah, which is the script for this ritual, doesn't do this at all. Right? You've probably at various points gone through the Haggadah and been like, oh, well, the main point is to recount the story of the Exodus at length. Where's the story? That's odd. And it's odd not just because, like, oh, but I need the story. It's that this is literally the script for this ritual. How could the main point not be there? So it turns out that there is an explanation for this. The explanation is that this story, which seems to be about 2nd century rabbis, is actually written in the 9th century. It is adapted from a much earlier story that was about rabbis spending all night studying law. But this story, not so much. This story is a story from the 9th century in Babylonia. It was added to the Haggadah text. It is the last thing that was added to the Haggadah text, which means, it was the last thing, and it is the only text in the whole Haggadah, or in all of rabbinic literature. Actually, I'm literally the only text in all of the rabbinic literature, until you get to like medieval rabbis who are quoting this text, that talks about recounting L'Saper, the Exodus. Before this story, there's no such phrase even. Well, what were they doing before? Well, what's the whole rest of the Haggadah kind of based on if it's not based on retelling the story? Well, so I'm glad you asked. The story, the rest of the Haggadah is based around the term lehagid, right? As in the verse, "V'higadata levincha b'yom," you shall explain to your child on that day, this is what God did for me. Now, lehagid is the basis for both the name of the book, Haggadah, the central section, Maggid, and lehagid is all, and I had at some point like 25, 30 examples of this from across Tanakh. I'm not going to share those. Lehagid is a statement that is brief and directive, information, instruction, right? When you have, right, we just read in the Megillah, right, that Mordechai heard about a plot and he told Esther, right, to pass it on to the king. Right, God gives Paro dreams, and Joseph explains to him that God, Higid, informed Paro of what God's planning to do. This is an instruction that leads to some kind of action. In other words, the rest of the Haggadah thinks that the point of the Seder is not storytelling, but is to convey knowledge of religious import. To convey to the child understanding that it's supposed to shape them, shape their kind of religious identity. And indeed, every time, there are tons of places in Tanakh where the Tanakh revisits or summarizes in some way the events of the Exodus. Every single time, it is summarizing or listing God's actions on our behalf. All of the other texts are essentially prayer or praise texts that focus on describing either to the Israelites or in singing to God, describing God's wondrous acts on our behalf. All of these accounts, it's not that they tell a winding story that goes from disgrace to praise. There are only two elements: our disgrace, and then praise of God for ending it. I want to look with you at one other example of such a text. It's a great example, partially because when I sat and really looked at it carefully, I kind of couldn't believe I hadn't really paid attention to it before. This is Psalm 78. And the thing about this, it's in some ways similar to other kind of texts of this nature. This one literally starts with, "I will expound a theme, hold forth and lesson to the past, things that our fathers told us, right? We will not withhold them from their children," right? And before I get to the red parts, which are the key, God established a decree in Jacob, ordained that charging our fathers to make them known to their children, and to their children, to their children. In other words, this is actually a psalm where the psalmist declares, "Behold, I am now going to fulfill the mitzvah from Exodus 12 of telling your children about the Exodus." And I'm going to tell you, and now I'm going to tell you exactly what I need to tell them when I do that, and why. So this is actually explicitly says, here's what one tells the children to fulfill this mitzvah, and here's the goal, the purpose of it. So what is it that I, the psalmist, am now going to tell my children? I'm going to tell the coming generation the praises of the Lord and his might and the wonders he performed, right? Tehilot Adonai, right? Praise of God, ve'ezuzo, v'niflaotav asher asa, the wonders God performed. In other words, the only thing I need to convey to the child in this mitzvah is God's might and the wonders that God performed for Israel, bringing them out of Egypt. And why is this so important? Why is specifically telling that so crucial? That they might learn to trust God, to not forget God's great deeds, which I would say to trust God, to love God, and to observe God's commandments. In other words, the point of this night each year of going back to the same story is not to like dredge and figure out how do I wring some new interpretation of the story each year. It is a simple and direct religious lesson, remembering God's deeds and God's wonders to inculcate trust in God, love of God, and loyalty to God's mitzvot. This picture is very different from our notions of the story in many ways, but the two most important, I think, for me are, number one, when we think about retelling the story, we think about retelling a very human drama. Exodus 1-12 is a very human story. The struggles, the uncertainties of frail humans, the fear, the wrong turns. It is a very human drama. But when we recount the Exodus, the theological lesson is conveyed only by telling God's story, by recounting what God did. So that's one. And the second thing is that in our minds, in our thinking about it, this telling the story is the thing, right? That's right. Telling the story, making it engaging, is its own end. But in the Haggadah text, what's key is not the story as much as the moral of the story, the lesson that is meant to be drawn from. Okay, I want to pause there and invite any questions or any thoughts so far, and then we're going to kind of shift gears and look at the Haggadah itself and kind of see how that plays out. So, Janina?
I feel as if I missed a transition.
Okay.
And sorry, because you started out, I thought, by saying that it's not the order one would expect. I mean, it's like the Torah text, we will do and we will hear, as opposed to the understanding and then doing the ritual. And I somehow maybe I misunderstood what you were saying, but I thought that you were going to be linking that to how you structured your analysis.
Right. So you thought there's not right. So I was not trying to focus on the question of the order in which we do things in the Seder. What I'm interested in is what story do we think we're supposed to tell and why? Because we really think and if you look at all the different Haggadot that illustrate it and represent in different ways or explain it, they're all, what they're doing is filling in a more detailed and lengthy and kind of nuanced recounting of the drama of, they're recreating, the Prince of Egypt, right? Right, this dramatic, gripping escape story, and we try to tell that. We imagine that that's the story we're telling, and therefore we are surprised we don't find it. And what I'm saying is that all of the other texts that frame, well, what's this Seder ritual about, assume that the Seder ritual is and the Seder liturgy is a liturgy of praise for God's salvation, for God's acts, for God, the miracles by which God brought us out of Egypt, and in focusing on God's miracles, inculcating a sense of love, a sense of debt to God, a sense of devotion to God.
Thank you.
I'm going to Mara.
Hi, yes, thank you. Can you explain when you said it's our disgrace and then praise of God for ending it? What is our disgrace?
So our disgrace really just means it really means our place of need, right? Meaning we were slaves is disgrace. Not that that's shameful in the way that we would think of it. It is that we were in a place of being denigrated or oppressed, and the point of that is that we were oppressed, and God rescued us from that, right? What it does is not, it's not like, right, it's, we often, I've read so many things that talk about this disgrace to praise or disgrace to glory as being like a rags to riches tale. Like we were in this lowly sort of filthy place, and then here now God led us to triumph and glory, right? That's not really it at all. We were in a terrible place. God brought us, saved us from that, and because of that, we now have this essentially eternal debt, which we repay in an ongoing way by serving God with loyalty.
Okay, thank you. So you could either replace the word disgrace with oppression or just a low place, correct?
Right.
Okay,
right.
Thanks.
Exactly. And by the way, the other version of in the Haggadah, based on the Talmud, of disgrace to praise is we were alienated from God, and then God brought us close, right? Which you can, again, the fact that we were alienated from God when we were, enslaved and didn't, or even since that version of the story starts back when Abraham had not even first encountered God back in Haran, right? It's not a question of blame. It's a question of being in a place of spiritual lowliness from which God raised us up. Okay.
Thanks.
So I am now happy to introduce you to, just in PDF form, but Yedid Nefesh Haggadah, which I thought was going to be on sale, but sort of on sale. I'm shipping them out by now, but this is I have it I'm just getting in a couple days in a beta version, and the final thing with will be out next year, which is one of those disappointments that you learn to live with in Jewish publishing. But here it is, and you will see that you of course don't need to turn the page while you're saying Kiddush. Always a very important. It's one of those things that is one of the nudnicky things that I get obsessed about. And so when I find people who are like, "Oh, I love the fact you don't have to turn the page for Kiddush," it makes me so happy. We're going to sort of scroll through here to the beginning of Maggid. So here we have the 4 questions taken straight from the Mishnah, and then what we have in the rest of Maggid is not a kind of continuous but kind of meandering single response to the question. What we have actually is, with a few digressions, 4 completely separate, discrete answers, each of which can and should be kind of like understood on its own. So start by looking at the first one. Right? We were slaves in Egypt, and God brought us out of there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. That is the story. That is not an introduction. That is the first answer. In terms of like, what is it that, right? In fact, that is an answer straight out of Deuteronomy chapter 6, and that is all according to the first kind of view, that you need to tell them about the events, right? The only thing you need to know is we were slaves, and it is entirely thanks to God that we are free. And then it does the crucial thing, the thing that you skip over if you're not looking for it. It gives you the moral of the story. Why do you need to know that God did that for us? Because if God hadn't done it for us, we would still be slaves there. What does that really mean? Literally, I don't know. But the importance of it is, it's not enough to know that God once did something for us long ago. You need to internalize, we need to internalize the sense that that's the beginning of a whole chain of events that led to the sort of establishment of Am Yisrael in the land, and then through that to all of the whole course of Jewish history. Right? If God had not brought us out, given us that moment of sort of national formation, we certainly would not be here as a Jewish community even centuries thereafter, let alone millennia thereafter. And so the first answer in the Haggadah is, you need to know that God did this, and you need to know it so that you have the sense that you personally owe your freedom and your identity to that event. Right? Very brief story and religious moral. Okay. The second half of this paragraph, as I mentioned, is actually completely unrelated and really misleading. Not misleading in an intentional way, but because this first half is an answer to the question, and then here it says, actually, no, answer the question. You need to like recount and discuss and analyze the story in with great sages all night. So right? That leads into the story of Bnei Brak and the this random Mishnah that gets put in there, and the 4 children. Then we get to second answer. I mentioned this a couple minutes ago. This is very clearly already in the Talmud. This is an alternative answer, right? One rabbi in the Talmud says, "Avadim hayinu," the other poses this text, and this text tells you at first our ancestors were idol worshippers, right? Which refers both to Abraham's family in Haran and then to the people who were slaves in Egypt and had no way of knowing about God. What is different about this answer is that in this answer, right, the move is from alienation or distance to, we were distant and God brought us close. What is parallel is actually more crucial, which is both of these first 2 answers are entirely stories about Israel and God. What God did for Israel and the ongoing relationship that must emerge from that. Okay. This one focuses more spiritually, and it broadens it broadens it because it means that it's not just that God brought us out of Egypt. It's God brought us out of Egypt and brought us to Sinai. And in another version of this, it's God brought us out of Egypt and led us through the desert, ultimately back to the land of Israel. But either way, this is a different story that is still about what God did for us, and thus the sense of debt, the relationship that is founded on those actions. That's answer number 2. Now, this text actually is longer. It goes on, it kind of weirdly ends here with him going down to Egypt. The actual text from Joshua goes on to go through the events of the Exodus also. It's cut off here because the third answer goes into those details. So kind of they now kind of work together. One's kind of leads into the other. But the third answer is the Midrash on Devarim 26 on my father was a wandering Aramean, or Aramean sought to destroy my father. Other thing. This version, and I'm not going to get into the Midrash itself because that's a whole other discussion, but this version is particularly pointed. It was originally said by Israelites living in the land securely when they brought the fruit of the land to the temple on Shavuot. It was very personal. God, the Israelite, am saying, God brought us out, led us to the desert and into the promised land, enabling the very life of peace and plenty that I am now living, and of which these fruits are the tangible result. All right. And so it's literally connecting and making a direct line of connection from the Exodus through the desert to the land of Israel, leading up to the present moment and the very things that I'm holding and for which I'm expressing gratitude. And that is now our third answer. So the first answer was just, we were slaves and God brought us to freedom. Just that brief slice. The second answer, we were distant and God brought us close, right? We're thanking God for not only bringing us out of Egypt, but to Sinai and giving us Torah. And here, the third answer, God starts in Egypt and traces essentially all the way up to the present day of the Israelite standing in the temple. But again, I want to emphasize, and I hope you kind of see the theme here, that each of these answers is focused on describing what God did for us, and thus framing the relationship that we need to have with God. That is the consistent theme. Here, I'm going to kind of, right, the plagues, everyone knows the plagues, right? The plagues seem like they occupy a big place in the middle of the Haggadah text, because we print them in really big font. It's actually just a list of the 10 plagues that comes at the tail end of this long midrash. We have kind of blown it up into a major kind of centerpiece. And the last piece of answer that I want to show you, because it is often talked about as the weirdest thing in Maggid, is Dayenu. If you have felt the sense of like what's going on in Dayenu, I don't get it. If you read Dayenu from the, if you think that you are talking about the story of the Exodus from the perspective of the Israelites, that we're describing the experience of the Israelites in coming out of Egypt, this is weird. Because if God had given us their money, not opened the sea so that we were stuck there and they could keep coming, that would not have been enough for us. I assure you, we would not have been so happy. If God had opened up the sea and not brought us across, right? Oh, look, the sea's open. Oh, but you can't go. That would not have been enough for us. But once you understand that Maggid is about declaring and reciting phrases of God for God's acts of wonder and kindness, Dayenu makes perfect sense. Because Dayenu means each of these would be enough to be worthy of gratitude and praise. It's like, and then I'll pause in 1 second after this. I think about it like this. If I tell you the story that I was injured and a stranger stopped to help me, used his own clothing to bandage my wounds, went miles out of his way to bring me to the hospital, it's irrelevant whether I needed all of those actions or could have, or if one of them would have been enough. It doesn't matter. Each of those things deserves mention because each of them was a remarkable act of kindness. That's the point. Each of these things that God did in and of itself is worthy of gratitude, of praise, of love, of appreciation. Taken together, the effect should be staggering. Yeah, I saw a hand. Norm, please.
Thanks. I'm curious about trying to analyze Dayenu with any amount of literacy, of taking it literally. The paragraph following it, I've always learned, was much older. It identifies the same 15 steps and simply explains that, God did all of these things for us. And theologically, it seems like that's a sensible thing to say. But Dayenu is such a catchy melody and such a fun thing that people remember it when they have forgotten everything else. I have very clear memories of visiting my late cousin Rose in the Alzheimer's unit of a local nursing home. And, you know, a week or two before Passover, I started singing a few Pesach songs. And when I got to Dayenu, not only did she perk up and sing along, not only did all the people at the table she was sitting at, the four of them, sing along, but within a matter of, by the time I was at the third stanza, the third line, the entire room of about 30 people were singing Dayenu with me. And,
Right.
They were absolutely thrilled to be doing this because this rang a bell to them. And these were all people with whom you really could hardly ever have a reasonable conversation. There were some who you could talk to about, but it wouldn't make much sense. Their memories were all but gone in most cases.
So I want to make the point that is absolutely true, and
moment for me.
That is absolutely true, and that is not in itself evidence that this poetic version is later. Just consider the Psalm 136 at the Great Hallel that we say towards the end. Hodu Adonai Kitov Kili Olam Chasto, Hodu Kili Olam Chasto, Kili Olam Chasto. Also, a whole list of wondrous deeds for which we want to praise God, and God's chesed is eternal after each one. You could make the same argument there, and yet I know that that poetic structure is the psalm, right? Is from the book of Psalms. So my point is that Dayenu, which is clearly modeled on that in the sort of going through kind of chronologically a list of actions of God, is not so illogical, in that it's saying that each one of these is a sign of God's chesed. Each one of these stands alone as a sign of God's chesed. I've looked and I've not found plausible any sort of convincing evidence that the little summary afterwards is earlier. The only argument for it that I have seen is that people don't understand Dayenu. So I would, sort of suggest to you that that once you understand it and see it in the context of other similar types of poems, and in the context of a series of texts that are all about sort of reciting God's praises, they make a lot more sense.
Josh, I just want to mention that we have about like 6 more minutes.
Ooh.
So if there's time for us to take some questions, et cetera, I just want to make sure that we don't cut you off, but also that others, if they have some questions, can have some time to ask.
I'm going to say one last thing, and then be a few minutes for questions. My favorite line in what I would say is the sort of crux line in the Haggadah text is B'chol dor v'dor chayav adam lirot atzmo ki'ilu hu yatsa mitzrayim. In each generation, we are to see ourselves as if we were released from slavery. I was always taught that this is about remembering the experience of slavery and compassion and all of those things. But it turns out that that's actually not true. I mean, not having compassion and those are all true. But the point here is not to remember, in the moment of the Seder, is not to remember that we were slaves or to remember what it was like to be slaves. The point is to feel like we personally were redeemed. Okay? The point is not to feel the feelings of the Israelites who were in Egypt, but to feel the feeling of the Israelites standing on the edge of the sea, seeing their oppression sort of washed away and given this and sort of joy and intensity of being given this whole new fresh start. And the idea being that if you put yourself in that, if you feel like you were like the redemption personally happened to you, you will be filled with a sense of joy, a sense of love, a sense of appreciation. And if you are, how did they respond to it on the edge of the sea? They couldn't help themselves. They burst into song, right? The song of the sea is this pouring out, literally, of these deep and powerful emotions, of having arrived at a moment that they had dreamed of for generations, right? And therefore, when it says therefore we must give thanks, it's not really we are therefore have an obligation. It's we therefore can't help but pour out thanks, right? And sing songs, right? We sing Hallel at night at the Seder because we are so filled with that sense of gratitude. Now, it is what's challenging is, and we don't have time to sort of, really sort of get into it. What's challenging is cultivating that sense of awareness of what we have that we might not have had, of being the inheritors of this tradition of the sacrifices that so many generations made to enable us to be where we are. That sense that we owe so much of who we are and what we have to this Jewish past, and therefore really be filled with that sense of love. That, while challenging, that is a task that maybe feels compelling and new. The task of immersing ourselves in appreciation and in seeing how much we owe to the people and the events that came before us. And if you can set that as a challenge for your Seder, you will really bring sacredness to that night. Okay, other questions, comments? Yeah, Junia, go ahead.
Two quick ones. One is it going to be sold at Haggadah's or Us next year? Is that where we should look?
Yeah.
Where your venture is. And the other is, who is the artist?
Right. So this is actually all graphics, which is done by my graphic designer. There is art that will be in the book that isn't in it yet, which is one of the pieces that wasn't ready in time. The funny thing about these processes, I started work on this with the designer I've been working with, and in November, basically, I realized that I needed sort of new people working on it. So it kind of went through a big redesign and started working on new art. So the graphics are by my graphic designer, who is an amazing guy in London. The art is to come. Here I can take you through the pages of the other.
Do we have any other questions?
I will end with one last. Let's just two little points about the book. So that when I tell people, "Oh, I'm working on a new Haggadah," right? The question is always, "Oh, well, what's your angle or your shtick or whatever it is. To a certain extent, I guess my shtick is kind of helping people to trying to make sense of what the texts that are in there and what they're each doing there and how they fit together. But mostly, I have discovered that the real answer is if you think about all of the Haggadot that you don't want to use, and start making a list of why you don't want to use them or why you find them frustrating. You have my list of criteria, right? I mentioned that there's commentary and there's art. There's no place that you have to start turning multiple pages to find the next text, right? Everything that I could possibly transliterate is transliterated. The people at your table who don't read Hebrew can sing along. The Hebrew text is always sort of prominent enough that if you're reading the Hebrew, it will read through and feel like a traditional text. I even have explanations of some of the songs at the end that people always ignore, because I hate that people ignore those songs. I love them. And it's right. It's meant like the bencher, and sort of even more so to be not a book that has its own what to say about the Haggadah as a text, but that enables you to access and approach and think about this text in a new way every year, which I think is what a Haggadah needs to be. So thank you so much for sharing with me. Appreciate it and love the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Joshua. This was amazing. Thank you for kicking off our Pesach programming this year. I really appreciate it. I just want to remind everyone who's here to join us next Wednesday at 7 p.m. This one's in person, sorry, Tybal, for Passover prep food of the Haggadah with Rabbi Jonathan Bernhard. That should be a really fascinating conversation on the use of animal products on our Seder table. So if that interests you, come on down. And if it doesn't interest you, come on down and hear his opinions. I hope everyone has a great rest of their evening, and we look forward to seeing you then. Joshua, thank you again.
Yasher Koach, Rabbi Khan.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. A lot of food for thought.
Yasher Koach. Before you go off,
Right.
Josh, I just want to say I'm an alum of Ramah, Wisconsin.
Oh, nice.
I grew up in Chicago. But I mean, I was alum many years ago, but so when was this Beit Midrash that you had to put together? Because I wasn't,
it was from 2000 to 2000. Well, the Beit Midrash was 2013. I was there from 2000 to 2007. But my mother was there from 1953 to 1959. So
because she's from Minneapolis.
She's from Minneapolis.
Who was your mother? Who was your mother?
Elizabeth Cahan Peelan. I think her last summer there was 1959. So we did go back away to Wisconsin, but I was there from I guess from 99 to 2007.
So when you say the Beit Midrash, I mean, so I'm confused. I mean, was that like our studying that we did every summer? I mean,
no. So we started with a kind of a sort of a Talmud intensive sort of like Judaic program, and then for about 12 or 13 summers, every summer we brought a group of about 6 college students to camp to basically have a summer yeshiva for 9 weeks.
Oh, how nice!
I mean, so many both wonderful friendships, but also people who are great teachers of Torah in their own right. Started out, studying in our Camp Midrash,
Nice. I was, that's interesting, because obviously it was happening when I was there and I wasn't aware of it. That's interesting. I mean, I was aware of the mishloachat that was there.
When were you at camp?
I don't know. I have to figure out my years. I think maybe 70, wait, 58,
Yeah. So
58, maybe 72 to 76
this is
to 80.
1999 to 2007. So a different.
Yeah, no, I was there before that. I was there
year,
like,
yes.
yeah, I was there 72 to 76 or 78,
Different year
something
in
like that.
so many ways. In so many ways.